People are leaving American cities. Not slowly, not quietly. In measurable, documented, census-confirmed numbers. Some of these cities have been losing residents for a decade straight. Others hit a wall during the pandemic and never fully recovered. Some were losing people long before COVID made moving fashionable. The reasons range from taxes to crime to housing costs to the simple fact that remote work made it possible to live somewhere else and still keep the job. These aren't ghost towns. They're major American cities with real economies and real populations. They're just smaller than they used to be and getting smaller faster than most people realize. Here are 10 U.S. cities Americans are leaving fast. City 10, New York City, New York. New York City lost more residents than almost any other city in the country between 2020 and 2023. The numbers from the Census Bureau are not ambiguous. In 2023 alone, New York City had a net loss of roughly 77,763 residents to domestic outmigration, meaning more people packed up and left than arrived from other parts of the United States. From 2019 to 2023, New Yorkers who moved out earned $68 billion more in income than those who moved in. That $68 billion in annual adjusted gross income didn't disappear. It went to Florida, Texas, and other parts of New York State. What that means practically is that the city isn't just losing people, it's losing the tax base those people supported. $14 billion of that income shift went specifically to Florida. $2 billion went to Texas. Another $23 billion went to other parts of New York State, meaning many people didn't go far. They just decided they were done paying Manhattan prices. The Citizens Budget Commission, which tracks New York City's fiscal health with the enthusiasm of someone watching a slow-motion car crash, reported that the city's population declined again in 2025 after 2 brief years of recovery. The city lost roughly 12,000 residents between June 2024 and July 2025, reversing gains of 163,000 in 2024. Gains that were almost entirely the result of international immigration, not people choosing New York over somewhere else. Between 2019 and 2023, New York City saw a net loss of 286,239 residents to other parts of New York State, 192,347 to New Jersey, 106,134 to Florida, and 61,910 to Pennsylvania. The Citizens Budget Commission put it plainly: the city lost residents across every income level, every race and ethnicity, and every age group. That breadth, not just wealthy people or young people or one demographic, suggests the problem isn't targeted, it's broad. The reasons residents give for leaving are familiar. Housing costs that have no rational relationship to what most people earn, a cost of living that penalizes you at every turn, and the persistent sense that the city isn't delivering enough value for what it charges. New York State and city taxes combined represent one of the highest effective tax burdens on high earners anywhere in the country. And with remote work making geography optional for many professionals, the decision to stay purely for career reasons has weakened considerably. School-age children have been leaving at a notable rate. New York City's school-age population fell by more than 100,000 students during the pandemic years. Families who figured out they could afford a house somewhere else, with a yard, good public schools, and a driveway, did the math and left. Many haven't come back. City 9, Los Angeles, California. Between July 2024 and July 2025, Los Angeles County lost 53,421 residents, the largest numeric population decline of any county in the United States. That is not a rounding error. Los Angeles County has fallen from roughly 10 million residents in 2020 to approximately 9.7 million today, a drop of around 300,000 people over 5 years. metropolitan Los Angeles swung from a population gain of nearly 25,000 in 2023 to 2024 to a loss of 62,454 in 2024 to 2025. The turnaround was swift, driven largely by a decline in international immigration that had been propping up the numbers, while domestic residents, the people who were actually choosing to be in Los Angeles versus somewhere else, continued leaving at a steady rate. Robert Rivani, whose real estate firm has watched a stream of California companies relocate their headquarters to Miami, described the sentiment bluntly. There is a real sense of burnout. They are paying insane taxes and getting absolutely nothing in return. People feel like they're living in a place that's draining them financially, and in exchange, they're dealing with rising crime, shrinking services, and a sense that everyone around them is trying to leave too. California as a state lost a net 239,575 residents to domestic outmigration between 2023 and 2024, the largest domestic migration loss of any state in the country that year, and the first time in a decade that California overtook Illinois as the top outbound state. The California to Texas migration corridor alone accounts for more than 102,000 people annually. A survey by Emerson College polling in October 2024 found that 56% of Californians had considered leaving the state for financial reasons, and more than half of those who did leave had incomes above $150,000, meaning this isn't just lower-income residents seeking affordable options. High earners are also calculating that Los Angeles isn't worth it. The exodus from Los Angeles is not exclusively wealthy people heading for the exits, though that's happened in significant numbers. Riverside and San Bernardino counties, the Inland Empire, gained more than 21,000 residents from Los Angeles County in recent years. Las Vegas saw a boost of more than 21,000 people from LA. These are middle-income families making practical decisions. The commute gets worse every year. The schools are underfunded, homeless encampments are visible from the freeway on ramps, and the rent keeps going up regardless. City 8, Chicago, Illinois. Chicago has been losing residents for 10 consecutive years as of 2024. That sentence deserves to sit there for a moment. 10 years? Since 2015, the city has lost more than 128,000 residents, and its current population of approximately 2.66 million is the lowest it's been since before the 1920 census. A city that had 2.7 million people in 1920 now has fewer than that, a full century later. In 2023, Chicago lost 8,208 residents in a single year. That was the third largest decline of any city in the country, behind only New York and Philadelphia. More than 347,000 Chicagoland residents have relocated away from the metro area since 2020. Cook County as a whole lost 188,000 people, or 3.6% of its population, between 2020 and 2023. The reasons people give are consistent across virtually every survey that's ever asked. Polling from NPR Illinois and the University of Illinois found that 61% of Illinoisans have thought about moving out of state, with taxes cited as the #1 reason. A 2016 poll from the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute found that 47% of Illinoisans wanted to leave, and that taxes are the single biggest reason people want to leave, with 27% citing taxes specifically. Illinois has consistently ranked near the bottom for state and local tax burden, landing in 44th place in the Tax Foundation's 2022 state and local tax burden rankings. Since 2000, residents leaving Illinois have taken an estimated $94 billion in annual adjusted gross income with them, according to IRS data. Beyond taxes, crime has been a relentless factor. Chicago's murder rate has consistently far surpassed peer cities, in recent years running nearly triple that of Los Angeles and roughly 5 times greater than New York's. Chicago rents rose 21% in 2024, even as Illinois has reportedly become one of the hardest states in the country in which to build new housing. A study by the Federal Reserve found that both high-income and low-income neighborhoods in Chicago have faced population loss, with low-income areas losing the most residents. At this rate, demographers project Chicago will fall from the 3rd largest city in the United States to the 4th, behind Houston, by around 2035. City 7, San Francisco, California. San Francisco lost more than 60,000 residents, over 7% of its population, between 2020 and 2022. That 2-year collapse was one of the fastest population drops any major American city has seen in recent memory. The city partially stabilized after that, with the AI boom drawing tech workers back and 2023 showing modest recovery. But the long-term picture is unmistakable. San Francisco lost nearly 34,000 residents over the 5-year period from 2018 to 2023, placing it among the 4 counties in the nation with the largest population declines. The pandemic exposed something about San Francisco that its boosters had been uncomfortable acknowledging. A significant portion of its population was there because of proximity to tech offices, not because they particularly wanted to live there at those prices. Once remote work made the commute irrelevant, the calculus changed overnight. San Francisco has always been expensive, famously, stubbornly, almost defiantly expensive. But the unspoken trade-off was that the job market and professional networking justified the cost. When offices emptied out, that trade-off collapsed. What followed was visible and stark. By 2023, nearly a third of commercial real estate in downtown San Francisco sat empty. Between 2020 and 2023, roughly 40 retail stores had closed around Union Square. The terms doom loop and urban decay entered regular local vocabulary, the theory being that fewer office workers meant less foot traffic, which meant more retail closures, which meant less street activity, which meant more visible disorder, which meant fewer people wanting to be downtown, which meant fewer office leases, and so on. Whether the doom loop fully materialized or whether the warnings were somewhat overstated depends on which part of the city you're standing in. The city has also struggled with a homelessness and open-air drug crisis that has been visible and severe in specific neighborhoods for years, and the concentrated nature of that crisis, disproportionately affecting downtown, the Tenderloin, and the streets around civic buildings, shaped the perception of the city nationally in ways that made recruitment and retention harder for businesses trying to bring workers back in person. One useful comparison for what San Francisco went through: Seattle, its closest Pacific Northwest peer city in terms of size and tech economy orientation, grew 0.8% in the year ending July 2023, a period when Portland was contracting. San Francisco similarly trailed comparable tech-adjacent cities during its sharpest period of decline. The divergence suggests that the specific policy and quality of life choices cities make during disruption have real and measurable consequences on whether residents choose to stay or go. The AI boom has injected genuine money and workers back into the city, and 2024 into 2025 showed a small population gain driven by reduced domestic outmigration. San Francisco is a city trying to recalibrate in real time, and whether the current recovery becomes structural or turns out to be a temporary tech sector pulse is a genuinely open question. City 6, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia lost 16,294 residents in 2023, the second largest numeric decline of any city in the country that year. Its population, which had been rising since 2006 and peaked at 1.6 million in 2019, dropped to roughly 1.56 million by 2023, and has settled near 1.57 million. The city hasn't recovered those pandemic-era losses. Philadelphia has a specific and persistent set of problems that make outmigration rational for anyone with the means to leave. For years, it carried the distinction of being the poorest large city in the United States among the country's most populous cities, a designation it held even as improvements were made. As of 2023, roughly 1 in 5 Philadelphians live below the poverty line, though that number had been declining. The city's median household income was approximately $60,300 in 2023, roughly $20,000 below the national median. Drug overdose deaths have been devastating. The city recorded more than 1,300 unintentional drug overdose deaths in 2023, the 7th consecutive year with more than 1,100 such deaths, giving Philadelphia the highest drug overdose death rate among its peer cities at 78.9 deaths per 100,000 residents. The Kensington neighborhood, in particular, became widely known as one of the most severe open-air drug markets in the United States, a humanitarian crisis visible to anyone driving through that part of the city. Crime fell significantly from pandemic-era peaks. Homicides dropped to 269 in 2024, less than half the 562 recorded in 2021. But property crimes remained sharply elevated through that period, and the combined total of major crimes hit a 20-year high in 2023 before beginning to decline. Car thefts increased 70% from 2022 to 2023 alone. The high number of property crimes, Pew's State of the City report noted, soured Philadelphians and suburbanites' attitudes about the city, making them less willing to go to the office or to visit cultural institutions or go out shopping. City 5, Portland, Oregon. Portland lost residents for 3 consecutive years through 2023. The city's population fell from around 658,000 in 2021 to 630,498 by July 2023, a drop of nearly 30,000 people. Oregon, the state it anchors, fell in population in 2022 for the first time since 1983, a statistic that underscores how much of Portland's appeal had historically been tied to people choosing to move there rather than being born there. The city's difficulties in the early 2020s played out very publicly. Significant downtown deterioration, rising property crime, car theft, and open drug use became defining headlines. In 2020, Oregon voters passed Measure 110, decriminalizing small amounts of all drugs in a landmark, and ultimately troubled, policy experiment. What followed was a visible increase in open drug use and street disorder, particularly in downtown Portland, that was widely documented and became a national story. In early 2024, the state legislature reversed course and recriminalized drug possession. The policy debate it generated nationally was a direct byproduct of what Portland experienced on its streets. Critics of local tax policy argued that a series of levies, including a preschool for all tax passed in Multnomah County in 2020, were pushing residents toward neighboring counties or across the state line to Vancouver, Washington, which doesn't have an income tax. Vancouver gained nearly 2,000 residents in the year ending July 2023, the same year Portland lost more than 4,000. Oregon state economist Josh Leaner framed the course shift plainly. People in the early 1980s left Oregon because there were no jobs. The recent exodus was different. Over the last 3 years, almost everyone who wanted a job in Oregon could get one, Leaner said. So it's fundamentally different now. What changed wasn't employment, it was the calculus of cost and quality of life. Portland's suburbs continued growing while the city's core shed residents, a pattern visible in cities across the country. City 4. Detroit, Michigan. Detroit's population decline is both older and more severe than almost any city on this list. The city has been losing residents continuously for decades, shrinking from a peak of approximately 1.85 million in 1950 to around 620,000 by 2023. That's a loss of roughly 2/3 of its population over 70 years. One of the most dramatic urban depopulations in American history. The reasons layered on top of each other over those decades: the collapse of the American auto industry's monopoly position, white flight following the 1967 riots, chronic disinvestment in public schools and infrastructure, and the municipal bankruptcy filed in July 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history at the time, with debts of more than $18 billion. Detroit was the first city where the term urban blight became a mainstream description of what happens when industry leaves and population follows. Wayne County, which contains Detroit, registered noticeable population declines through most of the 2020s. The metro area did show some rebound between 2020 and 2024, flipping from negative to positive growth, helped in part by immigration. But the city's core structural challenges, a tax base too small to fund adequate services, a public school system that has struggled for decades, and a housing stock with tens of thousands of vacant and blighted properties, haven't been resolved. One of the more striking features of Detroit's post-collapse landscape is the sheer amount of vacant land within city limits. At the peak of abandonment, estimates suggested that as many as 70,000 to 80,000 structures in the city were abandoned or blighted. The city has been systematically demolishing many of them, a multi-hundred-million-dollar effort that has cleared large swaths of neighborhoods that, within living memory, were fully occupied residential streets. Downtown Detroit has seen genuine investment and revitalization in recent years, anchored by Dan Gilbert's bedrock real estate portfolio and a growing tech and startup scene. The surrounding neighborhoods, for many residents, still tell a different story. City 3, Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore has been losing people for decades, and it shows. The city's population has declined from a peak of nearly 1 million in the 1950s to approximately 565,000 today, a loss of roughly 40% of its residents over 70 years. Between 2018 and 2023, Baltimore lost approximately 37,500 residents, ranking it among the top counties nationally for population decline during that period. The city's homicide rate has consistently ranked among the highest in the country relative to its population. In 2023, Baltimore recorded 262 homicides, a rate that placed it among the most violent cities in the United States on a per capita basis. The city has also ranked near the top of U.S. cities for drug overdose mortality. In 2024, Baltimore had approximately 59 overdose deaths per 100,000 residents, second only to Philadelphia among comparable cities. According to available data, the economic challenges compound the public safety concerns. Baltimore has a persistent poverty problem, with large portions of its population living in concentrated poverty in neighborhoods that have seen limited investment over generations. The city's tax base has eroded alongside its population, creating a familiar and self-reinforcing cycle. Fewer residents mean less revenue, which means reduced services, which drives more people out. Baltimore also has a specific structural disadvantage in that it is an independent city in Maryland, not part of any county, which means it cannot draw on county-level tax resources the way most American cities can. It funds everything from within its own borders, as those borders have come to contain a smaller, older, and poorer population relative to its peak. The fiscal pressure has intensified considerably. Maryland as a whole has seen net domestic outmigration in recent years, with residents heading to lower tax states like Florida, Tennessee, and Texas. Baltimore's position within a state that is itself losing residents to competing destinations compounds the challenge of attracting people from elsewhere. There are genuine pockets of strength in Baltimore: the Inner Harbor, Johns Hopkins Hospital and Medical Campus, the Federal Hill neighborhood, and a growing biotech and life sciences sector tied to the Johns Hopkins research enterprise. But the city-level population numbers have continued declining, and the gap between the thriving enclaves and the struggling majority of city neighborhoods remains wide and visible to anyone who spends time outside the tourist-facing waterfront. City 2, Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis stands out as one of the few Sunbelt cities on this list, a region that has generally been gaining people while Rust Belt and coastal cities lose them. Between July 2024 and July 2025, the Memphis metro area flipped from population growth to population decline, joining Los Angeles, Miami, San Diego, and Buffalo as metro areas that shifted from gains to losses in that period. The city has long grappled with a homicide rate that frequently ranks among the highest in the nation. In recent years, Memphis has appeared near the top of national violent crime rankings in multiple categories. The combination of high crime, concentrated poverty across significant portions of the city, and limited economic diversification beyond logistics and healthcare has made it hard to retain residents who have options about where to live. Memphis also faces something that many other Sunbelt cities are encountering for the first time: the erosion of affordability. While the city itself is not expensive by coastal standards, rising insurance costs, driven in part by increasingly severe weather events across the South, property taxes that have increased alongside home values, and housing prices that outpaced wage growth during the post-pandemic period have begun eroding the cost of living advantage that Sunbelt cities once offered as a default. The nearby logistics infrastructure, Memphis is a major hub for FedEx's global operations, has created jobs and economic activity that keep the city's economy functioning. But job availability alone hasn't been sufficient to counteract outmigration when the surrounding quality of life conditions remain unresolved. One useful comparison: Nashville, less than 3 hours east on I-40, has been gaining residents consistently through the same period. Both cities are in Tennessee, both have significant logistics and healthcare sectors, and both benefit from the state's lack of income tax. The difference in trajectory says something about how much local governance, public safety conditions, and investment in neighborhoods matter in where people ultimately choose to put down roots, even when the macro-level tax environment is identical. The broader lesson Memphis offers is that Sunbelt geography and low state taxes are no longer sufficient on their own to generate population growth. They're a necessary condition. They are not, by themselves, sufficient. City 1, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh's population decline is longer running and in some ways more structurally embedded than most cities on this list. The city peaked at approximately 676,000 residents in 1950 and has declined in nearly every decade since, reaching roughly 303,000 today. It is one of the few major American cities to have lost more than half its peak population over a sustained period. The Pittsburgh metro area also posted a greater population decline in 2024 to 2025 than in the previous year, making it one of only 2 metro areas nationally that saw increasing population losses rather than a slowdown. That stands in contrast to most other cities, where the rate of decline at least moderated as the pandemic-era migration surge wound down. The story of Pittsburgh is, in many ways, the story of American manufacturing writ large. The steel industry that built the city collapsed over decades of deindustrialization, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s, and the jobs never fully returned in equivalent numbers or wages. At its peak in the mid-20th century, the Pittsburgh area produced more steel than the entire country of Germany. That industry supported hospitals, schools, unions, neighborhoods, and a civic identity. Its departure took more than just the jobs. The city has worked hard to diversify. Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh have anchored a growing technology, artificial intelligence research, and healthcare sector. And Pittsburgh is regularly cited by affordability analysts as one of the most livable mid-sized American cities on paper. Low housing costs, walkable neighborhoods, a genuine arts scene. But affordable alone hasn't been enough to reverse the long-term trend, because Pittsburgh also has one of the oldest average populations of any major American city. With an older population come more deaths and fewer births, a natural decrease that in-migration hasn't consistently been sufficient to offset. The city's aging infrastructure is a tangible daily concern for residents. Roads and public transit systems built to serve a 600,000-person city are now being maintained for a population roughly half that size. When infrastructure was designed for far more people than currently use it, the per-resident cost of maintenance becomes disproportionately heavy, and that burden shows up in city services, which affects quality of life, which affects decisions about whether to stay or go. Pittsburgh is a city that knows what it used to be, is genuinely trying to figure out what it can become, and hasn't yet closed the gap between those two things. What these 10 cities share isn't a single cause. Some are bleeding residents to taxes, some to crime, some to housing costs that climbed faster than anyone's wages. Some lost their economic engine decades ago and have been adjusting, or failing to, ever since. And some simply watch the pandemic reshuffle the map of where people are willing to live and haven't yet figured out how to reposition themselves in a world where proximity to a downtown office is no longer automatically a selling point. What's also true is that population loss is not always the death sentence it sounds like. Smaller populations can be better served if a city can right-size its services and infrastructure without being overwhelmed by the transition. The problem is that the transition itself is expensive and disruptive, and the cities that have been losing population the longest tend to have the fewest fiscal resources to manage it. The cities that are growing in the South, in the Southeast, in parts of the Mountain West, aren't growing because they're perfect. They're growing because, for a meaningful number of people, the math works better there right now. That math changes. It always does. Texas and Florida, the top recipients of domestic migration in recent years, are already dealing with rising insurance costs, housing affordability pressures of their own, and infrastructure strain from rapid population growth. Today's destination cities are already making choices that will determine whether they end up on tomorrow's version of this list. Whether the cities on this list change their trajectory is, for the people who live in them, not an abstract question. It's about whether the place they've invested in, through taxes, through community, through decades of building a life in a specific city, can become a place that gives something back. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.